On the morning of Friday, May 21st, 2010, Dan Wozniak, a theater actor, approached his friend Sam with a simple request. Dan was only days away from his wedding, and he claimed he needed help moving some heavy boxes and equipment from the attic of their community theater. Sam, being the stand-up guy he was, didn't suspect a thing and agreed to help. The two men drove out to the empty theater, where Dan led Sam up a ladder and into the cramped, dark attic space above the stage. As Sam turned his back to begin moving the boxes, Dan reached into his pocket and pulled out a .38 caliber handgun. Without a word, Dan pointed the weapon at the back of Sam's head and pulled the trigger. But the bullet didn't kill Sam instantly. Instead, in a state of absolute shock and confusion, Sam stumbled forward and cried out for help. He actually believed the searing pain in his head was a massive surge of electricity from the old theater's wiring. As Sam turned around, he saw his friend standing there, not with a helping hand, but with a smoking gun. Before Sam could react, Dan fired a second shot into his head, finally killing him. Right after killing his friend, Dan went to an ATM to withdraw money from Sam's bank account, and then, that very evening, he went back to the theater and performed in a musical, singing and dancing on the stage directly below, where he had just committed a cold-blooded murder. As the curtain closed and the audience gave Dan a standing ovation, they had no idea they were cheering for a man who had just murdered his friend. They saw a charming, talented leading man, a persona Dan had spent his entire life perfecting. But to truly understand how this beloved community actor became a calculated monster, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a time long before the stage lights and the murder. Daniel Wozniak was born into a typical middle-class family in Orange County, California. For a long time, Dan was exactly the kind of person you'd want to be friends with. When he attended Los Alamitos High School, he wasn't a loner or a social outcast. He was the star of the show. He discovered a massive passion for performance early on and threw himself into the school choir and theater classes. He was naturally gifted, and his peers absolutely adored him. After high school, Dan studied drama at California State University and became a fixture in the local Orange County theater scene, most notably at the Liberty Theater, which was actually located on a military training base in Los Alamitos. He wasn't just a background actor either. Dan was a leading man. He was known for a very intense method acting style, which gained him a lot of respect from other performers. He starred in major productions like The Music Man, where audiences and critics alike praised his talent. But while his stage life was thriving, his real life was a mess. Theater doesn't pay much, and Dan was constantly struggling to keep his head above water financially. Because he was so outgoing and charming, he was great at getting sales jobs, but he was even better at losing them. He was fired from job after job, often following accusations of theft. No charges were ever filed, but a dark pattern was clearly emerging. Regarding his love life, Daniel Wozniak was one half of what many in the Orange County theater community considered a fairy tale couple. His fiancée was a woman named Rachel Mae Buffett, a fellow actor who actually held one of the most coveted jobs for any performer in Southern California. She played the Little Mermaid at Disneyland. Their relationship started exactly where you would expect for two people obsessed with the spotlight, on the stage. They were acting partners who frequently appeared in the same local theater productions together. Because they spent so much time together rehearsing and playing romantic leads, their chemistry eventually spilled over into real life. By the time 2010 rolled around, they were living together at the Camden Martinique apartment complex and were deep into planning a wedding that was set for late May. To anyone looking in from the outside, they were thriving, But behind the scenes, the engagement was incredibly dark. Their plans were grand, far beyond what two struggling actors could actually afford. Dan was desperate to give Rachel the high life, which included an expensive wedding and a luxury honeymoon on a Royal Caribbean cruise. However, Dan was broke. His financial life was a total train wreck. The main issue was that theater acting jobs for a fresh face in the business are notoriously low-paying, and they certainly weren't enough to cover Dan's bills. To make ends meet, he had to take on various sales jobs, but he lacked the discipline to keep them. He didn't really want to work and was repeatedly fired, often following accusations of theft. As the wedding date approached, the dynamic between them shifted. Friends and theater colleagues noticed that Dan had changed from a jolly fellow who led their group into someone who was reticent and hesitant. He began to follow Rachel's lead in everything, and rumors suggested that she convinced him to completely cut off contact with his parents. This left Dan isolated and under immense pressure to fund the lifestyle and the honeymoon he had promised her. Led by the pressure of being broke, Dan approached his friend Chris Williams and managed to secure a loan of $3,000 to help him keep his head above water. But Chris wasn't just giving the money away. He expected to be paid back, and he set a firm deadline for the repayment: Friday afternoon, May 21st. With that $3,000 loan from Chris Williams sitting in his pocket, Dan Wozniak had bought himself a little bit of time, but he knew the walls were still closing in. Dan was looking for a big score that would solve all his problems in one fell swoop, and as it turned out, he didn't have to look very far to find it. Right across the way, in the same Camden Martinique apartment complex, lived a 26-year-old named Sam Herr. Now, Sam was the kind of guy who commanded respect without even trying. He was a U.S. Army combat veteran who had just returned from a brutal 15-month tour at the peak of the conflict in Afghanistan. Sam had survived the front lines and returned home with a very specific goal. He wanted to use his military discipline to build a new life in political science. Because he had been stationed in a war zone for so long, he hadn't spent a dime of his pay. He had managed to save up a staggering $62,000 in combat pay, which was supposed to be his ticket to a stable future. One night, Dan and Sam were hanging out, just talking as friends do. Sam, being a trusting person, eventually mentioned the $62,000 sitting in his bank account. The second those numbers left Sam's mouth, Dan perked up. He didn't see a friend anymore. He saw an opportunity to liberate himself from his financial stresses. So, a sick plot started to take shape in Dan's mind. What if he murdered Sam and took his savings for himself? That would solve all of his financial struggles, and he could finally afford the grand wedding he planned for himself and his fiancée. Dan was so desperate for the money that he almost decided there and then to act on his plan. Move over. Dan knew something about Sam's past, which he could use in favor of his sick plot. Back when Sam was only 18 years old, he had been hanging around with some kids who were gang-affiliated in the Los Angeles area. During a turf war in Santa Clarita, one of Sam's friends was stabbed to death. While Sam wasn't the one who held the knife, the authorities at the time accused him of being indirectly involved. The specific allegation was that Sam had helped lure an enemy to the exact location where that fatal fight broke out. Because of that connection, Sam was arrested and hit with a massive charge: capital murder. He spent the better part of a year sitting in a jail cell, even entertaining thoughts of suicide, before he was finally acquitted of all charges and given a second chance on life. To Dan, this history was the ultimate weapon. He realized that if he murdered Sam, he could use that old arrest record, Sam's military combat training, and the public's perception of PTSD to convince the police that Sam had simply snapped and gone on the run. He figured the authorities would be all too eager to believe that a trained killer with a violent past had returned to his old ways. So, Dan convinced himself to do the unthinkable and murder his own friend. But in order to do that, he needed a weapon. Despite cutting off contacts with his parents, Dan made one final visit to his parents' home in Long Beach. He didn't go there to reconcile or say a proper goodbye. He went there with a much darker purpose. While inside the house, he managed to find and steal his father's .38 caliber handgun. On the afternoon of Friday, May 21st, 2010, Dan and Sam were hanging out at Dan's apartment when Dan's friend, Chris Williams, showed up to collect the $3,000 Dan had borrowed weeks earlier. While Chris waited for his cash, he watched as Dan spilled his guts to Sam about his financial failures. Shortly after, Dan told Sam he needed a favor. He needed help moving some heavy equipment from the attic of the Liberty Theater, where Dan was set to perform that night. The two men left the apartment together, leaving Chris behind with Rachel. They drove to the military base in Los Alamitos and climbed into the cramped, dark theater attic. As Sam turned his back to grab a box, Dan pulled out the stolen handgun and killed Sam. Dan then left the crime scene, used Sam's ATM card to withdraw a stack of cash, and returned to his apartment. He walked up to Chris Williams and handed him the stolen money to pay off his debt. That evening, Dan went back to that very same theater. While Sam's body lay in the attic directly above the stage, Dan performed in a musical, singing and dancing for a live audience. During his breaks off stage, Dan was busy on his phone. He wasn't checking reviews. He was using Sam's cell phone to text their friend, Julie Kibuishi. He sent Julie a series of desperate messages, claiming Sam was having a family crisis and needed a shoulder to cry on. He specifically told her to come over at midnight and alone. After the final curtain call, Dan rushed to Sam's apartment and waited in the shadows. When Julie arrived, she texted her brother that she was at the door and could hear crying inside. She walked into the apartment to comfort her friend, but instead, Dan lured her into the bedroom, claiming Sam was waiting there. As she stepped inside, Dan shot her once in the head, killing her instantly. Before the sun came up, Dan committed one final depraved act to complete his script. He staged Julie's body to make it look like Sam had murdered her in a crime of passion. He tore her jeans, pulled them below her knees, and used a black marker to write a cryptic message across her back. With the frame-up complete, Dan went home and went to bed, allegedly without his fiancée ever knowing he had become a double murderer. When Saturday morning rolled around, Daniel Wozniak woke up feeling suitably refreshed and headed back to the Liberty Theater to finish what he had started. He went back with a set of tools. In the dark attic above the stage, Dan proceeded to decapitate Sam Herr, cutting off his head, his hands, and his left arm, specifically because Sam had an identifiable tattoo on that arm. He then took those body parts and dumped them in a nearby park. Later that same evening, Dan returned to the theater for a second performance. He was caught on video laughing, singing, and dancing for the audience, seemingly without a care in the world. After the show, he even attended a cast party where he was photographed holding a beer and making a shaka sign with his fiancée, Rachel, by his side. While Dan was celebrating, a nightmare was unfolding for Sam's family. Sam's father, Steve Herr, had grown increasingly worried because his son hadn't checked in for over 24 hours, which was highly unusual for them. Around 9 p.m. that Saturday night, Steve went to Sam's apartment and made a gruesome discovery. the body of Julie Kibuishi. Because of the way Dan had staged the scene and the message he had written on Julie's back, the police immediately zeroed in on Sam as their prime suspect. They issued an all-points bulletin for a trained killer who might be suffering from PTSD, while the police were on a manhunt for Sam Herr, who they believed was hiding in the shadows. Sam's father, Steve Herr, was launching a desperate investigation of his own. He couldn't reconcile the gruesome crime scene with the son he knew, so he went straight to the person who had been spending the most time with Sam, Daniel Wozniak. During their meeting, Dan tried to lean into his role as a concerned friend, but his performance was flawed. He claimed Sam had come to him complaining about family problems, a blatant lie, as Steve knew he and his son were on excellent terms. When Steve mentioned that fraudulent withdrawals were being made from Sam's bank account, Dan's reaction was so odd and nervous that Steve immediately called the police and told them they needed to look at the actor. The investigation into Sam Herr's disappearance took a dramatic turn when police began tracking his credit card activity in the Long Beach area. While they initially expected to find Sam, they were surprised when bank surveillance footage showed a completely different person using the card. The breakthrough occurred when a second swipe was recorded at a pizza place. The police intercepted the pizza delivery driver blocks away from the destination to confirm that Sam's credit card had indeed been used for the order. Believing they were closing in on an armed and dangerous combat veteran suffering from PTSD, a SWAT team surrounded the house in Long Beach. Instead of a soldier, they found 16-year-old Wesley Freelick, who was scared to death. Wesley was an aspiring actor who idolized Daniel Wozniak, having worked with him at the Liberty Theater. He immediately explained to detectives that Dan had given him the credit card under an elaborate cover story. Dan told Wesley he was working on the side for a bail bondsman. He claimed the credit card belonged to a client who had recently posted bail. Dan asked Wesley to withdraw money and store wads of cash for him for safekeeping. Wesley unwittingly cooperated with the scheme because he was starstruck by Dan. He told investigators that Dan had been at his house just a few hours earlier to pick up $400. This revelation provided the direct link the police needed, giving them more than enough reason to suspect that Dan was involved in more than just a financial scam. With the link between the stolen ATM card and Daniel Wozniak firmly established, the police moved to make an arrest. They tracked Dan to a restaurant in Huntington Beach, where he was celebrating his bachelor party on the night before his wedding. Detectives entered a private room and made eye contact with Dan, who reportedly turned white as the blood drained from his face. Once in custody, Dan attempted to use his acting skills to spin a series of scripts for the investigators. He initially admitted only to a financial scheme, claiming he and Sam had concocted a plan to steal Sam's card, withdraw the money, and then have Sam report the funds as stolen to the bank. He then escalated his story, claiming that Sam had confessed to murdering Julie Kibuishi in a love triangle fit of rage after she chose her boyfriend over him. Dan told police that Sam had forced him to help him flee the state, threatening to kill both Dan and his fiancée, Rachel, if he spoke a word to anyone. While Daniel Wozniak was a seasoned stage actor, he proved to be, in the words of District Attorney Matt Murphy, very bad at improv when the stakes were highest. During his police interrogation, detectives successfully bluffed him by claiming they had found his DNA on Julie Kibuishi's body. This caused Dan's script to falter. In a desperate attempt to explain why he might have been near the victim, he told investigators he had entered Sam's apartment and seen 2 bullet wounds in Julie's head. This was a fatal mistake. Julie had long, beautiful black hair that completely concealed the wounds. meaning Dan could only have known there were 2 entry points if he was the one who pulled the trigger. While they had no real evidence of his involvement in the murder of Julie Kibuishi, Dan was held in a cell for credit card fraud. While Dan was in a holding cell for credit card fraud, he called his fiancée, Rachel May Buffett. During this recorded conversation, Rachel told Dan that she had spoken to Tim and that Tim was panicking because he was in possession of evidence with the murderer. Shortly after the murders, Dan had handed a backpack to his brother, Tim, and gave him simple instructions: get rid of it. Tim was described by investigators as not a real sophisticated guy, and he initially claimed he had no idea the backpack contained a murder weapon. Instead of destroying the bag or burying it, Tim simply threw it over a fence at their parents' house in Long Beach. Hearing that his brother was about to crack was the only time detectives saw Dan show genuine emotion. He realized the physical evidence was about to be found. Fearing his brother would be caught, Dan called the detectives back and delivered his famous line, "I'm crazy and I did it." When the police recovered the backpack from the parents' yard, they found everything they needed to convict Dan. The bag contained the .38 caliber handgun stolen from their father, the physical remains of the bullets used to kill Sam and Julie. It also contained Sam Herr's passport, financial information, and credit cards. Moreover, it had blood and DNA that directly linked the items to the crime scenes. While Tim wasn't part of the plan to kill anyone, his decision to hide the bag made him an accessory after the fact. In 2016, Tim eventually testified against his own brother in court. Because he appeared genuinely sorry and was seen as a person who was manipulated by Dan, Tim received a lighter sentence than the others, 3 years of probation. Following the 2016 trial, Daniel Wozniak was convicted on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. In one of the fastest deliberations in the history of Orange County capital murder trials, the jury took just 1 hour to find him guilty and recommend the death penalty. He was officially sentenced to death, a punishment the prosecution sought despite efforts from his defense team to delay the proceedings. Regarding Rachel May Buffett, her involvement has been a point of significant controversy and investigation. Early in the investigation, police suspected Rachel was involved in a cover-up after she backed up Dan's lie about a mystery man being present at the apartment with Sam Herr. Investigators noted her strange behavior and cool, calm, and collected demeanor during questioning. Some have speculated that Rachel was the mastermind of the plot, or an abusive partner who isolated Dan by convincing him to cut off all contact with his family months before the wedding. While authorities did not find enough evidence to charge her directly with the murders, she was arrested on suspicion of being an accomplice. She was eventually convicted of being an accessory after the fact. Rachel was sentenced to 32 months behind bars. Despite her public claims on Dr. Phil that she was a victim of Dan's deception, she served her time and was granted parole and released in November 2019.